Okay, good morning everyone. Or good afternoon, sorry. Hopefully you're all here to find out about psychology in Trinity College. I'm Dr. Sam Crummy. I'm a lecturer in the school, and my specialty is in organizational psychology, which you may not have heard of, but I'll explain a little bit about that as well as other aspects of psychology during the talk. So what I'm going to cover, I'm going to look at what psychology is, basic understanding of what the subject of psychology is about, some popular misconceptions about psychology, because people have often quite a misunderstanding of what psychology involves and what it's about. I'll go through the program at Trinity, the sort of subjects we cover, how the course is structured, etc. And then look beyond a degree in psychology. What do you do after you've got a degree? What are the career options within psychology? So what is psychology? There's many different definitions that have been offered of psychology, and if you pick up a psychology book in the library, you'll probably find a number of different definitions. But mostly they revolve around something like this: the scientific study of behavior of individuals and their mental processes. So there's a subject matter, which is how people think, how people act, how people feel, the whole area of people's behavior and experience that psychology is interested in. And then there's the methods that psychology uses to understand those, which are scientific methods. So it's basically taking the methods of science, which are the same methods that are applied in physics, biology, geography, any other science, and applying them to understand the mind, understand behavior, etc. So, is psychology science? Yes. And 95% of psychologists will say yes, it is a science, and we deal with it as scientists. Some people debate whether science is appropriate for all aspects of psychology. So there's branches of psychology that stretch the label of science. They're a little bit more like an art. So it's worth keeping that in mind. But it is very firmly based in research. So when we have a particular topic, say take any of these topics here that would be the subject matter of psychology. You'll have psychologists that are interested in addiction, phobias, learning, memory, social mobility, attitudes, causes of cancer, artificial intelligence, problem solving, etc., etc. Some of those are obviously what you think of when you think of psychology. Some of them are not. If you take something like causes of cancer, it seems much more medical, and yet there's quite a body of research that's looking into the effects of stress on your likelihood of contracting illnesses like cancer, and also looking at the psychological, the benefits of positive psychology in trying to cope with an illness, etc. So when psychologists take any of these particular topics, instead of sitting around in their desks thinking about the topic and reading about it and trying to think how psychology might be related to it, because we're scientists, we go out and do research on that topic. So we go and ask people questions about it. We might set up lab experiments where we bring people in, give them some exercises to carry out, do things in several different conditions and see what condition works better. We experiment. We actually go out and find out the data, and that's how we apply science, and we move the knowledge of the topic forward from that point of view. It's both a pure and applied science. What we mean by that is a pure science is we're doing the science simply for understanding it. We want to know how people remember things. We want to know what parts of the brain represent what type of memory. We want to know whether people tend to forget names quicker than they forget numbers, and why is that? The pure science of trying to understand how psychology works. And then there's the applied science, which is targeted at applied problems. And if you take something like memory, there's some very practical applied problems that we can encounter. How do you remember people's names? That phenomenon where you know you've met someone before and you're trying to remember their name, and it seems very rude that you haven't remembered their name. Can you solve that problem from a psychological point of view? And there's a whole range of other aspects when you go into the health services, you go into industry, you go into education. there's a whole range of problems that are related to psychology that psychologists bring their scientific knowledge to bear to try and resolve those problems and come up with good solutions. So, psychological theory must be supported by evidence, and here are some of the different methodologies that we use to gather that evidence. Lab experimentation is I suppose the standard tool of any science, of most sciences, that you try and isolate something in a lab, manipulate the different conditions in which it occurs, and trying to understand that phenomenon. And we're probably familiar with the concept of a lab in, say, a chemistry lab, where you can see the pipettes and you can see the different vessels, and you can imagine liquids bubbling up and titrating, etc. And that's the sort of stereotype of what a lab is. And you may be wondering what a psychology lab looks like. How does it actually look? Well, some psychology labs are quite technical. If you're studying neuroscience, you're interested in what's going on in people's brains, you will link them up to various sensors that can detect what's going on in the brain and present it on a screen, and then you will give people different tasks to do. You might give them a memory task, you might give them a computer game to do, etc. And you'll observe what's going on in their brain. That's a neuroscience lab. But there's lots of other types of labs that we would run. A social psychology lab would not have any equipment involved, but would bring people in to a room and get them interacting in a social context and observe how people interact, and maybe change the structure of the group, the number of people, the subject matter they're talking on, etc., and study it. So there's a whole range of... the idea of the lab is to try and isolate and control the conditions in which human behavior occurs, and to try and study the factors that affect how it happens. But a large amount of most of our behavior happens in real-life contexts, which are much more complicated than lab situations. And psychologists spend a lot of time out in real-life contexts trying to understand how people behave in school or in hospitals, etc., and do field studies. Surveys and interviews are a very common method of research. Surveys are a very efficient way of getting a lot of information from a lot of people. Interviews are a good way of getting in-depth information from people. We do archival research sometimes. We go back and look at documents from the past, newspapers, magazines, etc., and see what they say about psychology and how maybe culture has changed over time. And observation is a very fundamental research method as well, going out to naturalistic situations, observing what people do, documenting it, and drawing some conclusions from it. So, some of the popular misconceptions about psychology. Psychology is just common sense. You'll often hear people say, why do you want to study psychology? It's just common sense. If you have some common sense, you will know how to deal with people, etc. If you take the example of if you get attacked on the street and somebody robs you, are you more likely to get helped if if there's only one other person in the street, or if the street's crowded? Common sense would tend to tell you that you're much safer in crowded places where there's lots of other people. And in fact, psychologists discovered it's the opposite, that bystanders are much less likely to intervene if there's other bystanders around. There's some sort of psychological barrier that stops people doing something when there's others around. If there's only one other person there, they're much more likely to intervene to help you. So there's a certain amount of common sense in psychology, but there's also some challenging of common sense and some testing of what works and what doesn't. If you take the two proverbs you've probably often heard, it's too many cooks spoil the broth and many hands make light work. And they seem to be contradictory. Which is it? Do you want more cooks, or do you want less cooks so that you don't spoil the broth? How does that work? And it's a practical problem in organizational psychology, which is the field I work in, where you want to know how many people do you optimally need in a team to do a particular job. And psychology has addressed that, and they've looked at larger teams, smaller teams, and looked at dimensions of teams. How well are they organized? How many different levels of expertise do you have? What type of leadership do you need? How well do you define your procedures for that task? Look at all the dimensions of a task to try and work out how many cooks do you need, and how do you define those cooks, and what type of cooks do you need, etc. What psychology is not, it's not psychiatry. Psychiatry is a branch of medicine. If you want to do psychiatry, you study medicine first and then specialize. Psychiatrists can prescribe drugs. By and large, psychologists can't. So psychologists are focused much more on talking treatments and on counseling, on types of therapy, than on drug treatments. Psychology is not psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is very related to psychology, but it's a particular branch of study that takes the assumption that our subconscious experiences in the past affect our behavior now. It's not rigorously scientific. If you study psychology, you will encounter a lot of the ideas of psychoanalysis, but it's not a core part of psychology. Psychology is not the answer to who you are. If you've got an existential crisis and you're wondering, what am I here for? Psychology is not going to answer that for you. Psychology is simply the study of behavior. It's not an escape from all things mathematical. So if you don't like maths, you can't get out of it by doing psychology. So because it's research, a core part of the course is research methods and statistics, and you need to be prepared for that. Having said that, don't be intimidated by that. You don't need to have higher level mathematics to get into psychology. You don't need to have higher level mathematics to be able to cope with the mathematical requirements of psychology. Generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, if you can get the points to get into psychology, you should be able to cope with the mathematical elements of it. But you need to be aware that that's there, so you don't get a shock on your first day in college when your first lecture is about statistics. It's not a complete explanation of human behavior. Psychologists don't claim to have the full picture of why people act as they do. There's lots of other sciences that are related to it, sociology, medical science, etc., all of which contribute to the picture of understanding behavior and how it works. And psychology can be frustrating in that it doesn't come up with a cheat sheet that gives you the answers to all psychological questions. It tends to come up with a lot of very tentative answers because it's a very complex field, psychology. And you think you found an answer to something, and then it turns out with the next piece of research it's not as clear-cut as you thought. So concrete answers are not the easiest to come across. Okay, moving on to look at how we cover psychology in Trinity and how the course works within the School of Psychology. The bad news is that the entry points are very high for psychology. It's not that we set them high deliberately, it's just the demand for the course is very high. Single honours, I think this is probably slightly outdated. I think last year single honours was 545 and two-subject moderatorship was 565. But it's likely to be around that. That's the bad news. The good news from the points point of view is that if you can achieve the points to get into psychology, we only take in as many people as we can cope with through the 4 years of psychology. So once you get past the selection to get into the course, there isn't a further selection later on, which in a lot of other universities there is. It's easier to get into psychology in first year in a lot of universities, but then you have to do really well in it to be able to keep it on after first year. It's a 4-year course, and it's divided into 2 parts. The freshman years and the sophomore years. In the freshman years, the first 2 years, you will cover all the core elements of psychology. Social psychology, personality, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, and the basics of research methods and statistics. There's very little options in the first 2 years. Most of the subjects are required, are mandatory. When you get to the second 2 years, we give you a lot of options. So there's a whole range of options, and you get to choose not exactly completely freely, because there's 5 different categories and you have to choose a certain number from each of them. But within those categories, you have a choice as to which modules. So you can follow a little bit the direction you want to go with psychology at that point. There's 2 paths in psychology. You can either do psychology on its own, in single honors, or as a 2-subject moderatorship. And we often get asked what's a good subject to cover along with psychology. And it's really up to yourselves. There's a number of subjects that you can cover. Look at the possible subjects, and sometimes some people like to cover something that's very cognate to psychology, like sociology, and to have a grounding in an area that's very close to psychology. Other people like to pursue an interest in maybe French or music or something that's less directly related to psychology, and either of those are valid. The critical thing to remember is, in terms of your eligibility to become a member of the Psychological Society of Ireland, and therefore go on to further qualifications in psychology, you have to do 4 years of the degree in psychology. You can either do that through single honors or through a 2-subject moderatorship where you specialize in psychology in the final year. There are some subject choices where you have to decide which subject to do in your 4th year. And if you don't choose psychology, you haven't met the requirements of Psychological Society membership and can't go on to further degree in psychology. If you end up in that position, you can come back and do an extra year and top up your degree to that level. So it's not the end of the line. Some of the unique features of psychology: we don't take in a lot of people. We take in 50 undergraduate students every year, 20 to single honors or 30 to single honors and 20 to 2-subject moderatorship. We have a tutorial system which is quite unique, really. It's the old way of teaching that used to be carried out in the college many years ago, and was carried out, say, in Oxford and Cambridge over the years, where you have a tutor and have a small group tutorial with usually 3 people in the tutorial, and that meets every 2 weeks. You get a topic to go out off and research, and you come back and you give a presentation based on that topic and get a critique of your presentation and get feedback. So it's a very close relationship with the academic staff. So you get almost one-to-one feedback on your work, which I think is a very positive feature of the course. There's a big emphasis on practical and group work. So as well as lectures, you get a lot of practical exercises, experiments to carry out and write up. There's a number of group projects that you do. You learn to work and collaborate as a group in carrying out your work. And there's a lot of teaching of generic skills. We see psychology as well as a good preparation for a career in psychology. It's also a very good preparation for a career in any field. So you should pick up a lot of generic skills, writing skills, communication skills, collaboration skills, etc., which are good basis for any job. Some of the areas of expertise within the School of Psychology, we cover really the full range of the main areas of psychology: clinical, developmental, health psychology, etc. And then we have particular specialist areas such as neuro rehabilitation. How do you rehabilitate people who have had brain damage? There's particular emphasis in organizational psychology on understanding safety and the human aspects of safety, why people take risks, why people make errors in a workplace, how do you prevent those sorts of things. That's my particular field, and in the organizational end, we work with a lot of companies in aviation, in manufacturing, in the healthcare sector to try and help them manage human error and the risk of people making errors within their workplace. What can you do after your degree? As I said, psychology is a very good basis for moving into a whole range of fields as a basic degree. If you want to stay specifically within psychology, There are very few, I don't think there's any specialist area of psychology you can get a job with just with an undergraduate degree. So you need to go on to do further training, and there's a whole range of options available: clinical and counseling psychology, occupational psychology, educational, criminal or forensic. I think when you're sitting on the stand there's a huge interest in forensic psychology at the moment, and I think it's mostly because of TV programs like Criminal Minds and Cracker, etc., that people's interest has been sparked in that particular area. Sports psychology is a growing area as well. And then a lot of psychologists will go into research and into an academic career. They'll spend their lives researching topics and trying to advance the knowledge on a particular area. If you look at I don't know if that's legible there at the back, if you look at the percentage of people, we did a survey of our undergraduates from 2008, and about 36 of them, I think 36% went on to further study. So roughly a third, a couple of years later, were in further study. Roughly a third had gained employment, so they got a job in some area or other. And then some of them were still seeking employment. There were some that didn't respond, and some we didn't know what they went. So roughly a third go directly into employment, and roughly a third go on to further education. Some of the courses that people were studying, some of them were doing PhDs, Masters in Criminology, applied psychology, neuroscience, child and adolescent psychology, etc. So there's a whole range of options. And some people have even go on to do a medicine degree afterwards. They decide that that's the route they want to go, or they want to be teachers, and they go on and do primary school qualification. Within Ireland, there's a range of institutions that do postgraduate courses in psychology. It's worth perhaps looking on their websites and seeing the offerings that they have. Ourselves within Trinity, we have courses, postgraduate courses on clinical psychology, counseling psychology, and applied behavior analysis, and an applied psychology master's. So there's a few different options within Trinity themselves. A few of the frequently asked questions we come across: what's the difference between psychology and single honours and two-subject moderatorship? The difference is you cover all the same core modules, but single honours will have more specialist modules. So you'll cover more material. So there's certain modules that TSM people don't get to cover. Single honours will have more advanced research methods and statistics, and when it gets to the third and fourth year, single honours get to choose more options. But provided you take psychology for the full 4 years, your degree is equivalent, and it's recognised as equivalent after the course. What's a good second subject to do if you opt for TSM? I've covered that already. It's whatever you want to do. Where can you do postgraduate courses, and how difficult are they to get into? Where you can do them, there's, as I said, those institutions in Ireland. There's a lot of options in the UK and further afield. How difficult they are to get into really depends on the type of course, how popular that particular course is, and the reputation that it has. So a lot of postgraduate training, particularly in the area of clinical and counseling psychology, there's a high demand, and you can't expect to go straight from your degree into, say, a clinical psychology course. Normally people will have to spend a couple of years doing research or gaining experience by working as an assistant psychologist before they can get into a clinical psychology course. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I hope I've answered most of your questions. If you've got more, you can go to the psychology stand in the exam hall.